Maria Elena Rodriguez had always been the kind of woman who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival often meant invisibility. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes modest and unremarkable. She worked as a civilian contractor at Fort Henderson, maintaining the base's computer systems with methodical precision that earned respect from soldiers and officers alike. The military base buzzed with constant activity, but Maria moved through it like water through stone, essential yet unnoticed. She arrived each morning at 7 sharp, carrying her worn leather briefcase and a thermos of coffee that would last her until evening. Her office, tucked away in the administrative building's basement, was a sanctuary of humming servers and glowing monitors where she could lose herself in the logical world of code and circuits. Maria's colleagues knew little about her personal life, and she preferred it that way. They didn't know about the small apartment she shared with her younger sister Carmen, who was studying to become a nurse. They didn't know about the martial arts classes she had been taking for 8 years, ever since the night when being helpless had cost her more than she could bear to remember. They certainly didn't know about the steel that ran through her spine, hidden beneath layers of careful politeness and professional competence. Colonel Marcus Blackwood was everything Maria was not. Tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding, he moved through Fort Henderson like he owned every brick and blade of grass. At 45, he had spent 23 years in the Army, climbing ranks through a combination of tactical brilliance, political savvy, and the kind of intimidating presence that made both subordinates and superiors think twice before crossing him. His uniform was always immaculate, his graying hair cut to regulation precision, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Blackwood had earned his reputation during 2 tours in Afghanistan, where his strategic mind and ruthless efficiency had saved countless lives and earned him a chest full of commendations. Back stateside, he ruled Fort Henderson with an iron fist wrapped in military protocol. Soldiers jumped when he spoke, officers deferred to his judgment, and civilians learned quickly that cooperation was not optional in his domain. The first time their paths crossed, Maria was updating security protocols on the base's network when she discovered unauthorized access attempts targeting classified communication channels. Following proper procedure, she documented the breaches and submitted a detailed report through official channels. The report eventually reached Blackwood's desk, where it became evidence of security vulnerabilities that reflected poorly on his command. Maria learned about the colonel's displeasure secondhand, through whispered conversations and meaningful glances from her supervisor. Apparently, Blackwood had made it clear that he considered the report an embarrassment and that he questioned whether a civilian contractor should have access to such sensitive information. The criticism stung, but Maria had faced worse. She continued her work with the same quiet diligence, hoping the matter would fade into the bureaucratic background noise that surrounded military life. But Colonel Blackwood was not a man who forgot perceived slights easily. Over the following weeks, Maria began to notice changes in how she was treated around the base. Her access to certain systems was restricted without explanation. Requests for routine maintenance were denied or delayed. Her supervisor, a decent man named Lieutenant Morrison who had always treated her with respect, began avoiding eye contact and speaking to her in clipped, formal tones. The pressure was subtle but relentless, like water slowly eroding stone. Maria recognized the tactics for what they were, a systematic campaign to make her position untenable. She had seen similar patterns before, in other workplaces where powerful men decided that a woman had stepped out of line. The playbook was always the same: isolate, undermine, and create an environment so hostile that resignation became the only viable option. What Blackwood didn't understand was that Maria Rodriguez had been forged in fires much hotter than military bureaucracy. She had survived an abusive marriage that ended when she was 24, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the determination to never be helpless again. She had put herself through technical school while working 2 jobs, caring for her sister, and dealing with the slow, grinding machinery of a legal system that seemed designed to protect everyone except the people who needed protection most. During those dark years, Maria had discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu almost by accident. The gym was near her apartment, and the monthly fee was barely within her budget. She had expected to learn some basic self-defense moves and perhaps gain enough confidence to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times. Instead, she found something that changed the fundamental architecture of her soul. Her instructor, Professor Santos, was a compact Brazilian man in his 50s who taught with the patience of someone who understood that true strength came from more than physical technique. Under his guidance, Maria learned that size and aggression meant nothing compared to leverage, timing, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of doing. 8 years later, Maria wore a brown belt that represented thousands of hours of practice, countless bruises, and the slow transformation from victim to someone who simply could not be victimized anymore. She had competed in tournaments, though always in smaller events where she was less likely to attract attention. Her specialty was submissions, the art of using an opponent's strength against them until they had no choice but to surrender or face serious injury. The other contractors and civilian employees at Fort Henderson had no idea that the quiet woman who fixed their computers could tie a grown man in knots, or that she had once made a 200-pound construction worker tap out in 12 seconds during a training session. They saw only what she wanted them to see: competence, professionalism, and the kind of unassuming presence that made her easy to overlook. Colonel Blackwood, meanwhile, continued his campaign of professional harassment with the methodical precision he had once applied to military operations. Maria's parking space was reassigned to a spot far from the building. Her security clearance was reviewed twice in 2 months. Maintenance requests for her equipment were mysteriously lost or rejected for insufficient justification. Each incident was small enough to deny, defensible within the broad parameters of military protocol, and designed to send a clear message: you are not wanted here, and this will continue until you leave. It was a masterclass in institutional bullying, executed by someone who had spent decades learning how to use authority as a weapon. Maria endured it all with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else in her life. She documented each incident carefully, maintaining her own unofficial record of the harassment. She continued to perform her duties with scrupulous professionalism, never giving Blackwood the excuse he was clearly hoping for. And, late at night, in the safety of her apartment, she practiced her techniques with renewed intensity, working through combinations and scenarios with the focused determination of someone preparing for an inevitable confrontation. Carmen, her sister, noticed the changes in Maria's routine. The extra training sessions, the careful way she reviewed work documents at home, the occasional phone calls to her union representative. But, when she asked about it, Maria deflected with gentle humor and casual reassurances. There was no point in worrying Carmen, who had enough stress managing her nursing program and clinical rotations. Besides, Maria had learned long ago that some battles had to be fought alone. The system rarely protected people like her, women who worked in male-dominated environments where challenging authority was seen as insubordination rather than principle. She had seen too many good people destroyed by powerful men who knew how to use the machinery of institutional authority to crush anyone who dared to push back. But Maria also knew something that Colonel Blackwood had apparently forgotten in his years of unchallenged authority: strength came in many forms, and the quiet ones were often the most dangerous. Every time she stepped onto the training mats, every time she helped a newer student learn a technique, every time she chose discipline over anger, she was building something that no amount of military rank could touch. The confrontation, when it came, would not be of Maria's choosing. She was not the kind of person who sought conflict or who believed that violence solved problems. But she was also not the kind of person who would allow herself to be destroyed by someone else's cruelty. Somewhere in the space between those two truths lay the moment that would change everything for both of them. As winter settled over Fort Henderson, bringing shorter days and longer nights, the pressure continued to build. Maria felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, in the careful distance maintained by colleagues who had once been friendly, in the constant sense of being watched and judged and found wanting by people who had never bothered to know who she really was. But she also felt something else building, something harder and more focused than anger. It was the quiet certainty that came from years of preparation, the knowledge that when the moment came, she would be ready. Colonel Blackwood might hold all the institutional power, but Maria Rodriguez held something infinitely more valuable: the absolute conviction that she would not be broken by anyone, regardless of rank, title, or authority. The stage was set. The quiet woman and the powerful colonel, circling each other in the careful dance of institutional conflict, neither fully understanding what the other was capable of. Soon, very soon, 324 soldiers would witness something that would become legend, a moment when assumptions about power and authority would shatter like glass against the unyielding strength of someone who had learned to turn weakness into victory. The storm was coming, and Maria Rodriguez was ready. The quarterly security briefing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, when the last stubborn patches of snow still clung to the corners of Fort Henderson's parade grounds. Maria had been looking forward to a quiet day of routine maintenance when Lieutenant Morrison appeared at her office door with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Rodriguez, you need to be at the security briefing this morning," he said, avoiding her eyes as he spoke. "Colonel Blackwood specifically requested your presence." Maria felt her stomach tighten. In 3 years of working at the base, she had never been required to attend these meetings. The briefings were typically reserved for military personnel and senior civilian administrators. Her inclusion could only mean one thing: Blackwood was escalating his campaign of harassment to a more public arena. "What time?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the growing tension in her shoulders. 1000 hours. Conference Room Alpha. Morrison paused at her office doorway, finally, meeting her eyes. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and she saw something that might have been sympathy. "Maria, whatever happened between you and the Colonel, maybe it's time to consider a transfer request. There are other bases, other positions." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected but because it confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. The harassment campaign was working exactly as intended, creating an environment where even well-meaning colleagues began to see her departure as the simplest solution to an uncomfortable situation. "I appreciate the concern, Lieutenant, but I haven't done anything wrong," Maria replied quietly. "I'm good at my job, I follow protocols, and I respect the chain of command. If there's a problem, it's not mine to solve by running away." Morrison nodded slowly, but the doubt in his eyes remained. After he left, Maria sat alone in her office, surrounded by the gentle humming of servers and the familiar glow of monitor screens. She had 43 minutes to prepare herself for whatever Colonel Blackwood had planned, 43 minutes to find the center of calm that had carried her through every other crisis in her life. She closed her eyes and began the breathing exercise Professor Santos had taught her during her first month of training. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, hold for 4. With each cycle, she felt her heart rate slow and her mind sharpen. This was not anger she was cultivating, but focus. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not when walking into what was clearly going to be an ambush. Conference Room Alpha was the largest meeting space in the administrative building, capable of seating nearly 400 people in theater-style rows. When Maria arrived at exactly 1000 hours, she was surprised to find the room packed with personnel. Every seat was filled with soldiers, officers, and civilian contractors, all facing a raised platform where Colonel Blackwood stood behind a podium reviewing his notes. Maria scanned the crowd for a seat, aware that her late arrival was drawing attention. The only available spots were in the front row, directly in Blackwood's line of sight. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. The colonel looked up from his papers as she approached, and, for just a moment, she caught a flash of something predatory in his expression. "Miss Rodriguez," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily through the room. "How good of you to join us. Please, take a seat right up front where everyone can see you." The comment drew a few nervous chuckles from the audience, but Maria maintained her composure as she settled into the indicated chair. She folded her hands in her lap, kept her back straight, and waited. Whatever game Blackwood was playing, she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. The briefing began routinely enough, with updates on base security protocols and recent changes to access procedures. Blackwood spoke with the commanding presence that had made him legendary among his subordinates, his voice clear and authoritative as he outlined various administrative details. Maria began to wonder if she had misread the situation, if perhaps her inclusion was genuinely related to her role in maintaining the base's computer systems. That illusion lasted exactly 27 minutes. "Now," Blackwood said, his tone shifting slightly as he reached what was clearly the main event, "I want to address a serious concern that has come to my attention regarding security protocols and the unauthorized access to classified information." Maria's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She had reported the security breaches months ago, following proper procedure to the letter. The matter had been resolved through official channels, with improved firewalls and updated access controls. There was no legitimate reason to revisit the issue in a public forum. It seems, Blackwood continued, clicking to a slide that displayed portions of Maria's original security report, that certain civilian personnel have been taking it upon themselves to monitor activities that fall well outside their assigned responsibilities. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Maria could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere as Blackwood's implications sank in. He wasn't just questioning her professional judgment, he was suggesting that she had overstepped her authority in a way that threatened base security. The individual in question, Blackwood's eyes locked onto Maria's as he spoke, apparently felt qualified to make determinations about network security without consulting proper military authority. This kind of civilian interference represents a serious breach of protocol and chain of command. Maria's hands remained folded in her lap, but, beneath the table, her fingers had unconsciously formed the grip she used when preparing for a particularly challenging sparring session. She could feel her pulse steady and strong, could sense the familiar clarity that came when facing an opponent who had finally revealed their true intentions. "Miss Rodriguez," Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "would you care to explain to this assembly why a civilian computer technician believes herself qualified to make security determinations that should properly be handled by military intelligence?" The question was perfectly crafted, a verbal trap designed to put Maria in an impossible position. If she defended her actions, she would appear insubordinate. If she remained silent, she would seem to accept the implication that she had acted inappropriately. Either way, Blackwood would achieve his goal of publicly humiliating her while positioning himself as the defender of military protocol. Maria stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was focused on her. She could hear the creak of chairs as people leaned forward, could sense the collective held breath of an audience watching what appeared to be a David and Goliath confrontation. The difference was that this David had spent 8 years learning how to turn size and strength against themselves. "Colonel Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite its quiet tone, "I followed established protocol when I discovered unauthorized access attempts on the base's secure networks. My report was submitted through proper channels and resulted in improved security measures that have successfully prevented further breaches." The simple statement of fact seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Maria wasn't finished. "If there's a question about the appropriateness of my actions, I'd be happy to review the relevant regulations with you and this assembly. Section 4.2 of the Civilian Contractor Guidelines specifically requires immediate reporting of potential security breaches, regardless of the contractor's primary job responsibilities." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several officers were nodding slightly, recognizing the validity of Maria's position. Blackwood's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble under the weight of actual protocol and procedure. "Miss Rodriguez," Blackwood's voice had taken on a harder edge, "you seem to have missed the point entirely. The issue is not whether you followed some technical guideline, but whether a civilian has the judgment and authority to make determinations about military security." He stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to where Maria stood. Even from the raised platform, his physical presence was imposing, and the gesture was clearly intended to emphasize the power differential between them. "In my 23 years of military service, I've learned that there are consequences when people exceed their authority," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "Civilians who think they know better than trained military personnel often create problems that extend far beyond their limited understanding." The personal attack was unmistakable now. This had moved well beyond questions of protocol into something much more dangerous, a public confrontation between a powerful military officer and a civilian contractor who had dared to challenge his authority. Maria felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar sensation she recognized from training sessions when an opponent made the mistake of underestimating her capabilities. It wasn't anger, exactly, but something closer to the calm clarity that came just before applying a submission hold that would end a match definitively. "Colonel," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge that seemed to cut through the room's tension like a knife, "are you suggesting that I should have ignored a security breach because reporting it might make someone uncomfortable?" The question was perfectly reasonable, but the way she asked it, with absolute fearlessness in the face of Blackwood's intimidation, seemed to catch him off guard. For just a moment, his confident facade flickered, and Maria saw something she recognized from countless sparring sessions, the moment when a bully realized they had chosen the wrong target. "I'm suggesting," Blackwood said, his voice now clearly angry, "that civilians need to remember their place and stay in their assigned lanes. When someone consistently creates problems and refuses to accept guidance from their superiors, there are consequences." He took another step closer, and Maria realized with crystalline clarity that he was about to make the mistake that would change everything. The room had gone completely silent, 324 people holding their collective breath as they watched what appeared to be heading toward an unprecedented confrontation between a colonel and a civilian contractor. "Miss Rodriguez," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper but still audible through his microphone, "I think it's time you learned what happens to people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." The threat was unmistakable, delivered in front of hundreds of witnesses with the kind of casual menace that suggested Blackwood was completely confident in his ability to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge him. What he didn't understand was that Maria Rodriguez had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this moment, when someone with power decided that fear was an acceptable tool for maintaining control. Maria looked up at him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire exchange, but something in her posture had changed. Her weight was now perfectly balanced, her center of gravity low and stable. To most observers, she simply looked like someone having a difficult conversation with their supervisor. But anyone trained in martial arts would have recognized the subtle shift, the preparation that preceded decisive action. "Colonel Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, "I understand exactly what you're trying to do, and I want you to know that it won't work." The words seemed to hit Blackwood like a physical blow. In his decades of military service, he had never encountered a civilian who dared to speak to him with such direct defiance, especially not in front of hundreds of subordinates. The carefully controlled mask of military professionalism finally slipped completely, revealing the raw fury of a man who had built his identity on unquestioned authority. What happened next would be remembered and retold for years to come, the moment when assumption met reality with consequences that no one in that room could have anticipated. The silence in Conference Room Alpha was so complete that Maria could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the building's ducts. 324 people sat frozen, witnessing what appeared to be the final moments before an institutional explosion that would reshape everything they understood about authority and consequence at Fort Henderson. Colonel Blackwood's face had gone through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple that suggested his blood pressure had reached genuinely concerning levels. His hands, Maria noticed with the kind of hyper-awareness that came from years of reading opponents, had clenched into fists at his sides. The careful military bearing that had defined his public persona for over 2 decades was cracking like ice under pressure. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow more menacing than if he had shouted. Maria remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled. She had reached the point that Professor Santos called the eye of the storm, where external chaos couldn't touch the center of calm that came from absolute certainty about what she was capable of doing. "I said your intimidation tactics won't work on me," Maria replied, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite its conversational tone. "I've dealt with bullies before, Colonel. The uniform doesn't change the fundamental dynamic." The word bully seemed to detonate in Blackwood's brain like a small explosive. In 23 years of military service, through combat deployments and high-stress command situations, no one had ever dared to apply such a term to his leadership style. The fact that it was coming from a civilian contractor, a woman who should have been cowering under the weight of his authority, made it infinitely worse. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Blackwood's voice was rising now, the careful military diction giving way to raw emotion. "You think being a civilian gives you some kind of special protection?" He stepped down from the platform, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had never doubted his ability to physically dominate any situation. At 6 feet 2 inches and 210 pounds of military condition muscle, he had always been able to rely on physical presence to reinforce his authority. The fact that Maria stood barely 5 feet 4 and weighed perhaps 130 pounds only made his rage more intense. "I think," Maria said, turning to face him directly as he approached, "that my civilian status has nothing to do with basic human respect, which is something you apparently never learned despite all those years of military training. The insult hit its target with surgical precision. Blackwood's entire identity was built around the idea that military service had made him superior to civilians, that his years of discipline and sacrifice had earned him automatic deference from anyone who hadn't worn the uniform. To have that core belief challenged by someone he considered inherently inferior was more than he could tolerate. "You want to see what military training looks like?" Blackwood snarled, closing the distance between them with 3 quick steps. "Maybe it's time someone taught you the kind of respect you should have learned a long time ago." Lieutenant Morrison was halfway out of his seat, his face pale with the realization that the situation had spiraled completely beyond any reasonable boundaries. Several other officers were shifting uncomfortably, uncertain whether they should intervene in what appeared to be heading toward a physical confrontation between a colonel and a civilian contractor. But Maria didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, balanced and centered, watching Blackwood approach with the kind of clinical attention she normally reserved for studying video footage of tournament matches. Every detail of his movement was catalogued and processed: his weight distribution, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were positioned for a grab rather than a strike. "Colonel," she said, her voice still maddeningly calm, "you really don't want to put your hands on me." The warning was delivered without heat or anger, more like someone pointing out that a stove was hot or that ice could be slippery. But something in the absolute certainty of her tone seemed to penetrate Blackwood's rage, if only for a moment. He hesitated, standing close enough that she could smell his aftershave and see the network of small scars on his knuckles from decades of military training. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm giving you information," Maria replied. "What you do with it is your choice." For several heartbeats, they stood facing each other in a tableau that seemed to embody every power struggle between authority and principle that had ever played out in institutional settings. The colonel, representing decades of military hierarchy and unquestioned command authority. The civilian contractor, representing the kind of quiet strength that refused to be broken by anyone, regardless of rank or title. The decision, when Blackwood finally made it, surprised no one who had been watching carefully. His ego, battered by months of a campaign that had failed to break his target, simply could not tolerate being defied so publicly by someone he considered so far beneath his station. "Maybe you need a lesson in respect," he said, reaching out to grab Maria's shoulder in what appeared to be an attempt to physically demonstrate his authority. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered for years to come by everyone who witnessed them. The moment Blackwood's hand made contact with Maria's shoulder, she moved. Not with the explosive violence that might have been expected, but with the flowing precision of someone who had practiced the same movements thousands of times until they became as natural as breathing. Her left hand came up to trap Blackwood's wrist against her shoulder, controlling the point of contact while her body turned slightly to create the angle she needed. Her right hand reached across to grip his elbow, and, suddenly, his arm was locked in a position that gave her complete control over his balance and mobility. Blackwood's eyes widened as he realized that his attempt to intimidate had somehow put him in an extremely vulnerable position, but, before he could react, Maria was already moving to the next phase. She stepped back with her right foot, using his forward momentum against him, and applied pressure to his trapped arm in a way that immediately compromised his balance. The throw, when it came, was textbook perfect. Maria's hip became the fulcrum, Blackwood's own strength became the lever, and basic physics took care of the rest. The 6'2" colonel found himself airborne for a brief, surreal moment before hitting the floor with an impact that seemed to shake the entire conference room. But Maria wasn't finished. Before Blackwood could recover from the shock of finding himself on his back, she had smoothly transitioned to what Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners knew as an armbar. His right arm was trapped between her legs, his elbow joint isolated and vulnerable, with Maria controlling the angle and pressure that could either cause intense pain or serious structural damage. The entire sequence had been so fluid and precise that many of the observers didn't immediately understand what they had just witnessed. One moment, a powerful military officer was reaching out to physically intimidate a civilian contractor. The next moment, he was lying on his back with his arm extended in a position that made him completely helpless. "Colonel," Maria said, her voice still perfectly calm despite the fact that she now held a man twice her size in a submission hold that could snap his arm like kindling, I strongly recommend that you tap out." Blackwood's face was a mask of shock and rage, his free hand clawing at the floor as he tried to process what had just happened to him. In his entire military career, through combat training and deployment stress, he had never found himself so completely powerless. The psychological impact of being controlled by someone he had considered weak and insignificant was almost more devastating than the physical helplessness. "Let me go," he gasped, trying to maintain some semblance of authority even from his position on the floor. "Tap out," Maria repeated, applying just enough pressure to demonstrate that she could increase the stress on his elbow joint whenever she chose. "That's how this works. You made a choice to put your hands on me, and now you get to experience the consequences of that choice." The word consequences seemed to echo through the silent conference room like a revelation. For months, Colonel Blackwood had been applying consequences to Maria, using his authority to create a hostile work environment designed to force her resignation. Now the dynamic had shifted with brutal clarity, and consequences were flowing in the opposite direction. Lieutenant Morrison was on his feet now, his face pale with the realization that he was watching his commanding officer being dominated by a civilian contractor in front of hundreds of witnesses. Several other officers were starting to move, uncertain whether they should intervene or whether this had become something beyond their authority to address. "Sir," Morrison called out, his voice cracking slightly, "maybe you should tap out." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline that Blackwood was too proud to grasp. Tapping out would mean acknowledging that he had been defeated by someone he had spent months trying to destroy. It would mean accepting that his assumptions about power and authority had been completely wrong. Most importantly, it would mean doing so in front of an audience that would never forget what they had witnessed. Maria felt the tension in his arm as he struggled against the hold, testing its strength and trying to find a way to escape without submitting. But she had applied the armbar with the precision of someone who understood leverage and anatomy at a level that no amount of military training could match. Every movement he made only locked the hold in more securely. "Colonel," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, "you have about 10 seconds to make this decision. After that, your elbow joint is going to start experiencing damage that will require surgical repair." The clinical accuracy of the statement seemed to cut through Blackwood's rage and denial, forcing him to confront the physical reality of his situation. He could feel the stress building in his arm, could sense the precise point where discomfort would become pain and pain would become injury. Around them, the conference room remained frozen in a kind of collective shock. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody seemed to breathe as they watched the most powerful person on the base reduced to helplessness by the quiet woman who fixed their computers. The tap, when it finally came, was barely audible. 3 quick slaps of Blackwood's free hand against the floor, the universal signal of submission that ended the confrontation as decisively as it had begun. Maria released the hold immediately, rolling away from him with the same fluid precision she had shown throughout the entire encounter. She stood up, straightened her clothes, and looked down at Colonel Blackwood as he slowly sat up on the conference room floor, cradling his arm and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened to him. "Thank you for attending my demonstration of proper conflict resolution," she said to the silent room, her voice carrying a hint of dry humor that somehow made the moment even more surreal. "I think we've all learned something important here today." The silence stretched on for several more heartbeats before the whispers began, hundreds of people trying to process what they had just witnessed and what it would mean for everything they thought they understood about authority, strength, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on their size, gender, or civilian status. Colonel Marcus Blackwood, 23-year military veteran and undisputed authority at Fort Henderson, sat on the floor of his own conference room with a dislocated shoulder and the dawning realization that his career had just ended in the most humiliating way possible. The aftermath of what would come to be known as the incident in Conference Room Alpha unfolded with the swift inevitability of a controlled demolition. Within minutes of Maria releasing Colonel Blackwood from the armbar, the room had emptied as soldiers and civilian contractors fled to process what they had witnessed and, inevitably, to begin spreading the story that would define Fort Henderson's institutional memory for decades to come. Lieutenant Morrison was the first to approach the scene, his face pale with the kind of shock that comes from watching your entire understanding of reality get turned inside out in less than 4 seconds. He knelt beside Colonel Blackwood, who was still sitting on the floor, cradling his right arm and staring into space with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about the world had just been shattered. "Sir, we need to get you to the medical facility," Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral despite the surreal circumstances. Blackwood looked up at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. The calculating authority that had defined his presence for over 2 decades was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "She broke my arm," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that suggested he was still processing what had happened. "Actually," Maria said quietly from where she stood a few feet away, "I dislocated your shoulder." "There's a significant difference, though I understand the confusion given your current level of discomfort." The clinical precision of her correction somehow made this situation even more surreal. Blackwood turned to stare at her with an expression that combined rage, humiliation, and what might have been a dawning recognition that he had fundamentally misjudged who he was dealing with. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of every assumption that had just been proven wrong. Maria considered the question for a moment, then decided that honesty was the most appropriate response under the circumstances. 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu training, 3 nights a week, plus weekend seminars and occasional tournament competition. Professor Santos always said that the most dangerous opponents are the ones you underestimate. She paused, then added with the kind of matter-of-fact tone someone might use to discuss the weather, "You grabbed my shoulder in a way that gave me a dominant angle for a basic hip toss into an armbar. The technique is called yuko toshi in judo, though the Brazilian approach to the submission sequence is somewhat different." Lieutenant Morrison looked between them with the expression of someone trying to navigate a conversation that had moved well beyond his training or experience. "Sir, we really need to get you medical attention," he said again. But Blackwood wasn't ready to leave. Despite the pain in his shoulder, despite the humiliation of being controlled by someone half his size in front of hundreds of subordinates, he seemed unable to process the reality of his situation without getting answers to questions that were eating at him. "You planned this," he said, his voice gaining strength as he tried to reconstruct some narrative that would allow him to maintain his sense of control. "You knew this would happen." Maria shook her head slowly. "Colonel, I plan nothing except to do my job professionally and to defend myself if necessary. Everything that happened here was the result of choices you made." The accuracy of the statement hit him like another physical blow. In his rage and humiliation, Blackwood had been searching for some way to reframe the incident as part of a conspiracy against him, but Maria's calm response forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had orchestrated his own downfall through months of harassment culminating in a decision to physically intimidate someone who turned out to be far from intimidated. "You're a civilian," he said, as if that fact somehow invalidated what had just occurred. "You can't do this to a military officer." "I'm a civilian who was physically threatened by a military officer," Maria replied. "What I did was defend myself using reasonable force to prevent further assault. The fact that you outrank me administratively doesn't give you the right to put your hands on me." Her words were carefully chosen, Maria realized, with the kind of precision that suggested she understood exactly what had just happened from a legal perspective. Every aspect of the confrontation, from Blackwood's public threats to his decision to grab her shoulder, had been witnessed by hundreds of people who would be able to testify about exactly who had initiated physical contact. By this point, word of the incident had reached the base's senior command staff, and Maria could hear the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor outside the conference room. Within moments, the space was filled with officers, medics, and what appeared to be the entire administrative staff of Fort Henderson, all trying to understand how their Tuesday morning security briefing had ended with their commanding officer on the floor with a dislocated shoulder. The base's chief medical officer, Major Patricia Wells, took charge of Blackwood's immediate care with the kind of professional efficiency that military medical personnel brought to crisis situations. While the medics stabilized his shoulder and prepared him for transport to the base hospital, Major Wells turned her attention to Maria. "Miss Rodriguez, are you injured in any way?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "No, Major. I'm fine, thank you." "Were you threatened or assaulted by Colonel Blackwood?" The question hung in the air like a landmine. Maria understood that her answer would determine not just what happened to Blackwood, but potentially the trajectory of her own career and legal situation. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, people who were waiting to see how she would handle the most important moment of what had already become the most significant day in Fort Henderson's recent history. Colonel Blackwood made verbal threats against me in front of hundreds of witnesses, then initiated unwanted physical contact by grabbing my shoulder, Maria said, her voice clear and steady. I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to prevent further assault. Major Wells nodded and made notes on a clipboard. I'll need you to remain available for additional questions from the military police and base security. Someone will contact you within the next few hours to schedule a formal interview. As the medics prepared to transport Blackwood to the hospital, he made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his authority. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying what he probably intended as menace but came across as desperation. You have no idea what you've done. Maria looked down at him with an expression that combined sympathy and absolute resolve. Colonel, what I've done is refuse to be intimidated by someone who confused rank with character. What happens next will depend on whether you choose to learn from this experience or continue making the same mistakes. The response seemed to deflate something inside Blackwood, and he allowed himself to be helped onto a stretcher without further comment. As the medical team wheeled him out of the conference room, Maria found herself alone with Lieutenant Morrison and a handful of other officers who seemed uncertain about how to proceed. Miss Rodriguez, Morrison said finally, I think you should know that there will be an investigation. This kind of incident, involving a civilian and a senior officer, will have to be reviewed at the highest levels. I understand, Lieutenant. I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. There may be questions about your background, your training. Some people might wonder why a computer technician has the skills to do what you just did. Maria smiled slightly, the first genuine emotion she had shown since the confrontation began. Lieutenant, there's a difference between secrets and things people simply never bothered to ask about. I've never hidden my training. Anyone who was interested in knowing who I was outside of work could have asked. Over the following weeks, the investigation into the incident unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that military bureaucracy brought to anything involving potential criminal charges and career-ending consequences. Every aspect of the confrontation was examined, from the security briefing that had provided the setting to the months of harassment that had led up to it. The 324 witnesses were interviewed, their statements remarkably consistent in describing a situation where Colonel Blackwood had publicly threatened and, then, physically confronted a civilian contractor who had defended herself with what appeared to be reasonable force. Video footage from the conference room's security cameras provided additional evidence that supported Maria's version of events in every detail. More damaging to Blackwood's position was the investigation into his campaign of harassment leading up to the confrontation. Maria's careful documentation, combined with testimony from colleagues who had witnessed the systematic attempts to undermine her position, painted a clear picture of abuse of authority that had culminated in the attempted physical intimidation. The military justice system, when it finally rendered its judgment, was swift and decisive. Colonel Marcus Blackwood was court-martialed for assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His 23-year military career ended with a dishonorable discharge and the loss of all retirement benefits. The official record noted that he had created a hostile work environment for civilian personnel and attempted to use physical intimidation against a subordinate who had challenged his authority through proper channels. Maria, meanwhile, found her position at Fort Henderson transformed in ways she had never expected. The quiet computer technician who had preferred to work in the shadows suddenly found herself something of a legend among base personnel. The story of how she had defended herself against Colonel Blackwood was told and retold, growing in the telling until it took on the mythic qualities that military communities attached to moments of particular significance. But, more important than the fame was the change in how she was treated by colleagues and supervisors. The systematic harassment that had defined her work environment for months disappeared overnight, replaced by a level of professional respect that she had never experienced before. People who had once avoided eye contact now made a point of greeting her warmly. Officers who had once dismissed her input now listened carefully to her recommendations. The base's new commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Chen, made a point of meeting with Maria during her first week in command. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, "I want you to know that what happened with Colonel Blackwood will never be tolerated again under my command. You handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism, and I hope you'll consider staying with us for the long term." Maria appreciated the sentiment, but she had already made her decision about the future. The confrontation with Blackwood had clarified something important for her, not about her ability to defend herself, but about what she wanted to do with the skills she had spent 8 years developing. 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez submitted her resignation from Fort Henderson to open her own martial arts school. The school, located in a converted warehouse 20 minutes from the base, specialized in self-defense training for women and girls. Her first students included several female soldiers from Fort Henderson who had heard about what happened in Conference Room Alpha and wanted to learn from the woman who had turned the tables on a powerful man who had thought her helpless. Professor Santos, now in his 60s, came to the grand opening of Maria's school and watched with obvious pride as his former student demonstrated techniques to a crowd of eager beginners. "You understand now," he said to her afterward, "that the true purpose of training is not to hurt people, but to make sure they cannot hurt you." Maria nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a basement office at Fort Henderson to this moment of new beginning. "I understand, Professor. And I understand that sometimes the most important victories happen when people finally realize they don't have to accept being victimized." The incident in Conference Room Alpha became part of Fort Henderson's permanent folklore, a story told to new arrivals as both a cautionary tale about the abuse of authority and an inspiring example of what could happen when someone refused to be broken by institutional bullying. But, for Maria Rodriguez, it was something simpler and more personal, the moment when 8 years of patient preparation met an opponent who had mistaken her silence for weakness and discovered, too late, that the quietest people are often the strongest. In the years that followed, Maria would train hundreds of students, many of them people who had faced their own versions of Colonel Blackwood and needed to learn that they had options beyond submission or retreat. She would tell them, as Professor Santos had told her, that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the absolute certainty that no one could hurt you. And, sometimes, late in the evening when her last students had gone home, Maria would think about that moment in Conference Room Alpha when 324 people had watched a quiet woman teach a powerful man the difference between authority and strength. It had lasted only seconds, but those seconds had changed everything for both of them, proving once again that the most important battles are often won not through aggression, but through the simple refusal to be defeated by someone else's cruelty. The colonel had threatened a quiet woman, expecting fear and submission. Instead, he had discovered that some people cannot be broken, no matter how much institutional power is brought to bear against them. It was a lesson that cost him everything, but one that liberated Maria to become exactly who she had always been meant to be.